Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the AIM Growth Partners podcast. Really excited for this episode. It's the first of its kind that I've done. So today I'm joined by Craig Kennedy, the partner of HF and head of cyber consulting. Craig, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Pleased to be here.
To start us off, Craig, it'd be good to get a bit of an insight and a background to yourself before we get stuck in, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. So I am a career litigator. I've spent 18 out of the last 20 years working in commercial disputes and fighting about whatever one can fight about in a civil court. I, during most of my career, had a focus on financial crime and investigations. And of course, cybercrime really is now financial crime. And because my practice was inherently reactive, I became quite evangelical a couple of years out from GDPR going live about using my reactive skill set to go and speak to businesses about the sorts of things that they could be doing ahead of time to improve their operational and technical levels of resilience to reduce the prospect of them needing my services post a crisis.
It's interesting, one thing you touched on there, and I'm sure it's a theme that we'll be exploring throughout the podcast, but that whole reactive nature as well, because I think cybersecurity inherently, or a lot of cybersecurity, is incredibly reactive. I know there's a lot more kind of proactive sort of technologies and solutions out there, and there's much more talk about, cyber hygiene and good cyber practices. But fundamentally, it does seem like firefighting for a lot of businesses, cybersecurity.
Yeah.
So understanding the kind of the context and your background, it would be good, if possible, to start with a bit of a history lesson, because obviously background in law, financial fraud risk and all that sort of stuff. But it seems like cyber law is a relatively new field. Give us a bit of a history lesson.
Yeah, of course. Well, it's hard to think of an area that's come on so far in such a short space of time. And really the genesis of what we see now in the statute books started in the late 80s and early 90s. So, back before the internet, and I'm old enough to remember those heady days, businesses in the sort of late 80s and early 90s were just starting to wake up to the benefits of a more connected world. So things like, the widespread rollout of ATMs, emails between offices, and for most people back then, a home PC, to the extent there was one at all, would be used for fairly basic, word processing or design or gaming capabilities. And because there was really not a widespread domestic use or indeed commercial use of technology back then, there wasn't really a lot of law to cater for it. And that was quite acutely felt in one of the earliest hacks, I suppose you could call it, which involved an early precursor to the internet called the Prestel system. Now, that was a little bit like teletext, which you may remember, first you could sort of pull up script on your television and you needed a TV, some technology and a phone line to access this. And you could access services like news feeds, train times and shopping, but it was slow and it was very, very clunky. Journalists alighted upon the fact that it may be possible to guess usernames and passwords of this system. And the poor Duke of Edinburgh was one of the casualties of that enterprise. So his inbox was compromised. The journalists managed to gain access to his messages. Now, whilst they didn't, really do anything malicious with those or profit from them, they still accessed them and breached the privacy, and they were prosecuted. But back then, there was no law to deal with the prosecution, so it was kind of a mishmash of fraud-type offences that they were charged with. And ultimately, it was overturned on appeal. Now, there was quite a lot of embarrassment, as one might imagine, back then. So that hastily resulted in the Computer Misuse Act coming in. And that made unauthorised access to systems a crime. It made unauthorised modification of files a crime. And really, that's still at the heart of the UK cybercrime sort of picture today. So it's been updated over time. It now, deals with malware offences, denial of service offences, but, struggles with some of the more modern threats that you see emerging quite quickly. So things like botnets, ransomware on a service and these sorts of things. But that said, I do have some sympathy with the criticism that's made of legislation dating, because ultimately these threats develop every day. So that was really the first main thing where they tried to sort of outlaw hacking. Fast forward to the end of that decade and we saw the Data Protection Act, and the Data Protection Act really for the first time imposed legal duties on businesses to keep the data that they held safe. So that's kind of a shift from outlawing hacking to imposing a positive obligation on businesses to keep data that they hold safe. And really, that was one of the main things that pushed cyber resilience and data protection from what was historically seen to be an IT issue into a compliance and governance issue. And really, so those were the sort of early sort of bedrocks, if you like, of the legislative framework. You may remember at the turn of the millennium, there was a lot of worry and concern about the millennium bug, when the clocks and your calendars digitally were going to click from 99 to 00, and the concern that rather than step forward
Y2K, was it?
Yeah, a year, we were going to skip back 100 years. And there were quite apocalyptic predictions made about that, about planes falling out of the sky, payment systems failing, etc. But to my mind, that was the first, or one of the first kind of eureka moments more widely in society, that widespread digital disruption would bring with it quite significant consequences for society and commerce. And of course, there was a big push put in ahead of the millennium arriving to make sure that systems would be able to cope. Yeah, I mean, those I think are the early years. That's developed quite significantly since then, but the first decade of connectivity, those were the main kind of milestones and concerns.
So I think there's a lot, I guess, to kind of unpack, but just sort of summarizing what you were saying there, that, going back to way back when there wasn't much connectivity, that we didn't have these powerful computers in our back pocket. We weren't communicating doing this all digitally. So with this increased connectivity, naturally came increased risk. And when you have high profile instances, like you mentioned, the Duke of Edinburgh, people are then going to start taking these things seriously. Let's drill into, GDPR, something we've mentioned a number of times. So talk about the turning point when GDPR was implemented and some of those early fines that made people really wake up and start taking this stuff seriously.
Yeah, so maybe before I reach there, I'll just put a little bit of history in to set the context. So, come the year 2000, home computing was much more prevalent. Most houses had access to the internet, and the early sort of versions of ransomware that we saw really were targeted at the individual. So home computers were being targeted, people were being locked out. A small ransom of $30 or $40 was being demanded to repatriate people with their iTunes, with holiday pictures and things like it. The first big commercial breaches that we saw really came between 2013 and 2016. And that did a lot to really sort of focus minds about cybersecurity. And so Target, you may remember, suffered an issue through a third-party supplier, where their sort of EPOS systems were compromised, card details were compromised, and brought with it significant losses and regulatory fines, board disruption in terms of senior departures. That kind of shone a light on the fact that businesses could be attacked and compromised through their supply chains. Then we had the famous Yahoo breach, which came to light during merger and acquisition activity. And now that was sort of linked to a state-sponsored attacker, and again remains one of the largest data breaches to date. I think 3 billion accounts or something similar were said to have been compromised. So again, you start to see the scale of the problem with these matters. One of the most interesting ones, I think, was the Sony attack. Now, that was said to be a North Korean threat actor called Guardians of Peace that took exception to a parody movie that Sony was making about the North Korean leader. And wiper malware was said to have been deployed, and they were sort of leaking information out that they managed to compromise. Now, that really brought a more sinister aspect to this. So it's not just financially motivated attacks that businesses are potentially facing. There's some state-sponsored stuff, and rather than trying to deploy an attack for gain, sometimes it could just be malicious to try to destroy and cause maximum disruption. So we have the supply chain being compromised, the huge scale data breach, a nation-state attack. We then had TalkTalk, and you may remember TalkTalk suffered very serious disruption at the hands of what we call script kiddies. So dabbling teenagers who managed to come up with a reasonably basic attack but caused a huge amount of damage both financially and reputationally, resulted in the largest at the time fine from the ICO for the data breach. And then finally, in that very short period, the Ashley Madison data breach, which you may recall hit headlines. Ashley Madison was a dating website of sorts to sort of promote and facilitate extramarital affairs. So when the databases of its clients and subscribers were compromised, caused huge embarrassment, was said to have been undertaken by a hacktivist that had a moral objection to extramarital activity. And that alone spawned a huge number of spin-out scams where people would be sort of offering to search the databases and see if people were on it, to try to extract money through embarrassment from the people it impacted. So we saw in that very short period, huge corporate disruption at the hands of script kiddies, nation states, financially motivated hackers, and sort of ethical hacktivists. And when you see the scale of the losses and you see the scale of the disruption and the impact, the existing data protection legislation, at least in the UK, felt quite inadequate in terms of sanctions for losing that kind of volume of data. So that, sort of, as a matter of fact, were the events that were the precursor to the General Data Protection Directive going live. And that really put, data protection on the map. I remember that, lots of clients were in a flat spin about how they could comply, the policies and procedures that they would need to put in place to ensure that they didn't fall foul of the sanctions, which were very, very significant. That like 20 million euros or 4% of global turnover was the maximum sanction capable of being imposed under GDPR. And that really got boards' attention. So we saw a shift from, sort of the old legislation to GDPR, which mandated accountability at board level, where businesses had to prove that they were taking it seriously, to prove that it was a board priority, and, to start implementing things like data protection impact assessments and various other measures where they could prove to regulators that they were taking the protection of data seriously. I remember comments being made at the time by the Information Commissioner, Elizabeth Denham, and I paraphrase, but she effectively said something like, businesses have got a duty to keep data safe and will make no apology for sanctioning them if they fail to observe those duties. And the first kind of two big casualties that we saw in terms of fines were British Airways and Marriott hotels. And, both of those suffered cyber episodes where, hundreds of thousands of records were compromised and very, very significant fines were imposed. I think the initial fine announced for BA was in the region of 183 million, which was subsequently reduced on appeal. And Marriott's, I think, was around 99 million, and again, reduced on appeal. But it was a real sign to the market that, this wasn't going to be a toothless wonder, that, the regulators were taking compliance with it seriously, and that very serious sanctions would be faced in the event that businesses failed to observe their data protection duties.
So really, this was that kind of pivotal moment where the companies and boards started realizing we actually need to have that duty of care, duty of responsibility. Because I think, I don't know about you, but I'm always a bit cynical when I see businesses that you realize actually a lot of their money and their revenue stream is from harvesting our data and selling it on to people. Maybe their shop front, what they're selling isn't making much, but it's our data and what they can package up and sell on to other people.
Yes.
So it's nice and it's refreshing and reassuring to know that there are certain protections in place.
So in many ways, it was GDPR or, the run up to it that sort of gave me the interest that I have in cybersecurity, because it was obvious to me when I was researching the provisions that the large fines that I've just discussed are more likely to be encountered through things like cyber disruption than pure policy failings of defective documents, etc., these sorts of things. And so it is seen. And the obvious weakness, if I can call it that, is that with GDPR, we saw a massive tightening of data protection obligations, but it didn't explicitly, at least, talk about a correlative improvement of cybersecurity. So that was, what took me on the path that I took to go and start to speak to clients about what that would actually mean in practice, and to almost kind of fill that lacuna with, sort of my experience as a disputes person as to, what I saw after the event and the sorts of things that would be helpful before the event.
And following on from that then, so with your interest specifically being in this space and because of the GDPR, the kind of act that kind of came in, arguably or undisputably a landmark moment in terms of data protection. Now there's so many other kind of regulations and standards out there if we look at kind of NIST regulations, for example. So
Yeah.
talk to us around the kind of purpose of such regulations and what they achieve.
So GDPR was really focused on protecting personal data. But I think by the time we arrived at the kind of mid 2010s, we saw that we couldn't outlaw hacking. It wouldn't work. We saw that we couldn't legislate away the data protection problem. And the legislation started to look more towards resilience. And so came the Network and Information System regulations. And the focus of that was really to sort of protect essential services and critical national infrastructure. So that was to ensure things like energy, transport, health, water, and digital infrastructure could withstand and recover from cyber incidents. So whereas GDPR's focus was protecting data, the NIST regs sought to protect society by placing resilience obligations on critical national infrastructure that would acutely impact society in the event there was to be a significant outage. The obvious difficulty with imposing rules like that is there's no one size fits all. And the language that was used in the regulation is quite interesting. So it talks about businesses taking appropriate and proportionate security measures. So to my mind, that is an acceptance that there is no one size fits all, and that what will be appropriate and proportionate will vary from person to person. And the sort of enforcement framework was delegated to the regulators per sector. So it sort of acknowledged that it would be dealt with on a sectoral basis. But to my mind, it was a positive step forward because you start to see some consideration being had to what the impact would be of a significant outage of critical national infrastructure and specific measures being put in to try to guard against those impacts.
So you mentioned cyber resiliency a few times here, but from what you're saying, it sounds like, through Cyber Resiliency Act, we can achieve much more kind of national resiliency. And by that, I mean, you talked about, improving the security of critical national infrastructure. Now, beyond it just being an embarrassing or even a costly sort of data breach and a leak of data being a bit of a slap on the wrist and a GDPR fine, if these systems and our critical national infrastructure goes down, say it's BT, say it's, I don't know, some energy or water treatment facility, the ramifications and the consequences are huge. You mentioned nation state actors a number of times, and we'll be direct, we are at war. Do you know what I mean? We have got a lot of hacks and attacks from kind of nation state actors. So talk to us about, the overarching kind of goals of the Cyber Resiliency Act and how they kind of came about and what they aim to achieve.
So, I think you're absolutely right that we're at war, on a number of different fronts. In a sense, a lot of the directions that were coming out from places like the National Cybersecurity Centre were talking about the unpredictability of cyber warfare. So very often as the missiles go this way, cyber attacks will come back over in a form of kind of asymmetric warfare. And at the point that you don't have a financially motivated threat actor who are reasonably predictable and reasonably consistent to deal with because you ultimately know what their end objective is, a state-sponsored attack that's politically motivated is a much more dangerous thing because their sole objective will be destruction, and that can bring with it, in the sorts of sectors that we've spoken about for critical national infrastructure, really quite dire consequences. So if we think about the energy sector, for example, there is significant volumes of literature that exists internationally about how to collapse Western power systems. Now that can only exist for one reason and one reason only. And so when we think about the kind of geopolitical conditions and the various range of motives from threat actors, one can readily see why we want or we need to have some form of obligations put in place with a view to keeping our critical national infrastructure safe. And, we've seen steps towards resilience with things like DORA, the Digital and Operational Resilience Act in the financial services sector. So that is really, to my mind, the first meaningful step towards mandating what the appropriate steps are to achieve resilience. And so that talks about those in the financial sector doing things like threat penetration testing and regular vulnerability testing, having resilience drills to prove that things work, crisis simulations at board level, and, sort of third-party supply hygiene considerations. So that really is the first attempt to hardwire resilience into the financial services sector. And NIS2 follows. That will widen the existing NIS regs across Europe. It covers 18 sectors, so energy, health, transport, and digital, but includes food, manufacturing, post, and public admin. That puts in more stringent obligations round about resilience, faster incident reporting, stronger penalties, and puts a clear line down that there's board accountability, that this is not an IT issue, it's a boardroom duty. And the UK is following suit. Brexit has cut across NIS2 so far as the UK is concerned, but the Cyber Resilience Bill is moving through Parliament. Sometimes it's called NIS 1.5 because it continues on that theme. But again, it's looking to bring in managed service providers, data centres, etc. into scope. Again, much like NIS2, puts in sort of stricter and stronger reporting requirements. And it, makes some attempt to future-proof itself with the Secretary of State, having a power to expand it into new and developing sectors. So, to my, sort of thoughts, is still an exit. Back to 10 or 15 years ago, cybersecurity or cyber crime was it was a national security tier 1 risk. And the fact that we're now continuing to legislate in this way, I think shows that this is still a national security priority. And, there's a recognition that despite Brexit, those in the UK have to align themselves as best they can with the sort of comparable measures that exist through Europe and beyond.
Regulation, I think, typically we think of it being quite slow and it's quite clunky, yet we've talked about all the advancements and how much more sophisticated, regulation is in this sort of space. So with that in mind, how quickly do you think these things are going to be moving, and how quickly do businesses sort of need to respond and up their sort of cyber resiliency or cybersecurity game?
I think technology will certainly continue to outpace regulation. There's no question of that. So the regulations will always lag. And I suppose there's an obvious reason for that, because until the threats exist, you almost can't legislate against them. So I think it's commendable that this sort of legislative drive towards resilience continues. I think it will continue to continue. What does it mean for businesses? Well, since at least the GDPR, but probably the Data Protection Act before it, businesses have been trying to sort of change and modify their working practices to take account of the rules that are coming in. And I think that drive will continue. So, AI, I know something we'll come on to look at, but, that's the thing that's being wrestled with from a sort of security and a governance perspective right now. The post-quantum computing is something that will continue. It will just be another development that businesses require to cater for as and when the time comes. But I agree that a roadmap is sensible, because you have to be aware that these changes and huge technological leaps are coming, so that you don't face a cliff edge in terms of a 2-year or a 3-year plan that subsequently becomes obsolete. It's much easier to try to keep it relevant by sort of horizon scanning what might be coming down the line and starting to take account or make provision for that, either with allocation of budgets or, hiring of staff or expertise. It's much easier to take a sort of wider view of things and see the way that things are going. So I think that something like a 10-year plan for most places would be wise.
And with cyber resiliency, it's so much more. We've moved on so much from cybersecurity being seen purely as an IT problem, and achieving cybersecurity requires buy-in, help, support from various different teams. So talk to me around the importance of getting all these different skill sets, personas, and sort of departments involved in, building this cyber resiliency.
Yeah, so it's all very well to talk about cyber resilience as an obvious and commendable goal, but it's a completely different thing to think about what actually needs to be done to achieve that in practice. And one of the reasons that cyber is so difficult for most organizations is it's so inherently multifaceted. So if we think about, an incident response to a cyber breach or a cyber attack, that for most businesses would involve input from the board, from the IT and incident response teams, from in-house legal teams, from external legal advisors, digital forensics experts, law enforcement agencies, insurance, where it applies, PR and communication teams, business continuity managers, HR to manage what's going on within the business, and certainly client relationship managers to kind of keep existing client bases appraised. Now, each of those people will have a very discrete and separate role to play in what inherently requires to be a coordinated response to whatever the incident is. So it's the very multifaceted nature of it that makes cyber difficult. So when we talk about resilience, you can't really laser in on one of those areas to the exclusion of the others. It has to be a widespread education and testing of all of these capabilities, and making sure that they are coherent, they all understand what they have to do, and that they all knit together quite neatly. And to my mind, resilience really needs, from the get-go, some key players to invest in it. So lawyers will need to sort of translate the legal and regulatory duties into plain obligations, and boards will have to be invested in the drive towards resilience. They have to drive change within their organisation and invest in resilience programs. Risk managers and consultants within the business would need to sort of identify and plug skills gaps and look to sort of enforce policies and procedures, etc., throughout the organisation that mandate resilience. The incident response teams need to know what they're doing, and the IT teams and external security teams need to know what what's expected of them to make sure that they can sort of play their part for resilience as well. So quite often I find boards understand the duties that are placed on them, but they struggle to turn it into practical action. And quite often in the cybersecurity industry, they talk about board apathy. But to my mind, I don't think it's apathy. A lot of the boards I speak to, cyber is either the top or one of the top risks on the risk register. So I think it's unfair to talk about boards being apathetic. I think actually they're confused because they don't often fully understand the cyber risk within their organisation, far less what their third parties bring to their risk profile. It's a common problem that the boards and the IT teams just don't speak the same language. So there can, at technical level, be some confusion about what their security posture looks like. And I think most boards want to do the right thing. I genuinely do. But in a world where there's a very crowded market that's full of buzzwords and technology continues to advance all the time, lots of the technical solutions claim to be silver bullets. We now have AI solutions layered on top of it. There's a lot of uncertainty over, what to prioritize, who to trust and market. And, at the point that you know that you want to do something, but you don't really know what that something is, it effectively results in paralysis, because fear of making a wrong decision results in no decision being taken. So, I think actually, despite the fact there's so much noise round about, resilience as a whole actually boils down to something that's quite simple. So having your appropriate paperwork in place, so policies, plans, procedures, playbooks, that actually spell out what needs to be done in the event that you encounter cyber disruption, has to be the starting point. Roadmaps, those are the things that are going to keep, things on track within the business at the point something goes wrong. Exercising, so making sure that everyone that has a part to play in those documents has practiced and knows what they're doing, is critical, because you can't do this for the first time in a live fire environment. You have to test realistic threats to business. And what you sometimes find in critical national infrastructure is they will exercise and exercise and exercise what I would call more conventional business threats. So medical evacuations, environmental issues, sort of health and safety type problems, but they won't grapple cyber because it's difficult, it's challenging, and there's a knowledge gap about how to do it. So exercising to make sure that your policies, plans and procedures work is important. And then actually reviewing what the output of that is. There's no point doing an exercise if you don't learn any lessons from it. So if once you've sort of put your crisis teams through their paces, you're able to see who's performed well, who's performed less well, are there any knowledge gaps, do things need to be fixed? All of that needs to be done because it should be a continual cycle of improvement. to make sure that lessons are learned in these test environments, so that it's not just well, we did it and we got a 5 out of 10. We did it, we got a 5 out of 10, and this is what we need to do to make it a 10 out of 10. So within the business, the paperwork, the exercises, and the learning lessons from exercises is an essential part of achieving this resilience journey. And then beyond that, you start to look at things like your third parties and supply chains, etc., and assess the risk that's brought in. But the formula to achieving resilience, to my mind, is really quite simple.
So it sounds like really these businesses need to break down the silos a little bit more and, well, either A, get someone that's an expert or knows enough about all these different areas, whether it's law, compliance, cyber, and IT, or you just need to break down the silos within organizations, get more kind of cross collaboration. IT talking to legal, talking to whatever other departments, because this is a team sport for want of a better phrase, and it's a collaborative effort, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, because the frequency at which this is done will depend. So it will be different for different organizations. But at the very least, rather than having a prescriptive, well, we'll do this once a year or we'll do this twice a year, to my mind, I think it's much easier to have the frequency driven by events in the world. So we saw the disruption that the scattered spider attack brought with it. So it rampaged through retail, then insurance, then aviation. And the attack vector on that was really sort of founded in social engineering. So at the point that you had, sort of exercise that focused on something other than that, at the point that that's a real and present threat, it would be sensible to start doing something to educate the people that were on the front line of that. So the IT help desks that were being compromised, sort of educated about what to look out for, enhanced security questions, things like that, so that they could spot an attack and you would be better placed to deal with it. So at the point that there is a real and present danger, it's better to meet it head on and try to do something about it ahead of time by putting in extraordinary training beyond the existing schedule, because that's the best way to keep it safe. You can't really schedule threats because you have to deal with them as and when they arise, and something as serious and widespread and aggressive as those types of attack, it's sensible to do it. And my bet is that very few businesses will have updated their crisis documents in light of these attacks.
And looking at AI, something we've not touched on a great deal so far, it'd be interesting to understand from a legal, from a regulatory, but also a legal perspective, what the impact of AI has been. I've had, dozens of guests on here talking about specific kind of attack vectors, talking about the sophistication of like AI deepfakes, for example. Interested in understanding from a legal perspective what the common challenges and trends are you're seeing that have been sort of enabled or enhanced through AI.
So again, AI is the new kid on the block. It's the thing that everyone's talking about. It's the thing that everyone is being seduced by currently in terms of the efficiencies that it said it can bring. We have the EU AI Act, which is the first comprehensive AI law. It advocates a risk-based approach, so it sort of tries to sort of characterise or put things into 3 buckets of unacceptable risk, high risk, and limited risk. It also has sanctions that are capable of being imposed for misuse. The US is finding its way. It's got no single federal law yet. They are sort of feeling their way with with the rules surrounding AI, as is the UK. It's taken a pro-innovation approach. And so there's no single law, but the regulation of AI is going to be passed into existing regulators like the FCA and the ICO, etc., to oversee AI use in their sectors. So far as the threat scope, I think largely we're going to be seeing sort of conventional legal remedies being used to deal with that. So things like the payment diversions that famously took place for one organisation following a payment being made after a deepfake requested it. That would bring with it this usual conventional remedies of freezing orders and sort of trying to recover the money that way. The one big thing that I think is often overlooked is the way in which AI extends the attack surface. And any of the ethical hackers that I've worked with in my career will say if it's smart, it's vulnerable. If it connects to the internet, it can be compromised. So at the point that it does bring all these benefits, it also brings risks. And it's just another thing within your digital suite of products that can go wrong or be compromised. And we don't really fully understand all of the risks yet, but the common consensus is that AI will be used to massively amplify all of the threats that currently exist and create more beyond that. And so we're talking about things, or we're hearing about things like data poisoning or prompt injections, where the guardrails can be taken off AI models, and bad things can be done with them. And as you say, we're starting to see hackers using AI as a weapon. Deep fakes are now fairly commonplace to try to trick people into doing things. And as people start to more widely integrate AI into their business, that will start to create a supply and chain and dependency risk. So we saw globally that it happened the last time there was a significant service outage following a botched update. It caused chaos across a number of sectors. And if business starts to adopt AI, which it probably will from a handful of key players, again, if there's an outage, it brings with it quite significant impacts if the business isn't able to operate without it. So it's fine to put these things in place, but it comes back to resilience to make sure that organizations can exist and continue to operate when the technical things fail.
I guess it's a very difficult kind of tug and war. I'm just thinking about from a business perspective that there's that kind of train of thought that if you're not adopting AI, if you're not innovating, if you're not integrating this into your workflows, you're getting left behind because your competitors will be doing it. But at the same time, you want to ensure that you're doing it in a safe and controlled way. So I guess with that being said, and also from a legal way, what are the biggest red flags or challenges, things people should be aware of when they're adopting and implementing AI?
So I think it begins with governance and accountability. So the business needs to know who's in charge of AI. It shouldn't just arrive one day and dazzle everyone with its brilliance. People have to ask the difficult questions about who owns AI within the business. Do they know what data sets the models are trained on? If any of their customers asked about their AI integrations, would they be able to answer questions about the finer points of technical detail? So I think it starts with that. Data security and privacy is obviously a huge concern at the point that it's overwhelmingly tempting for people to use it for shortcuts. There's a real risk that if you don't have acceptable use policies and things like that put in place, that information will just sail out of a business onto an AI platform and is lost to the ether. And there's all sorts of concerns about breaching data protection laws, or even inadvertently breaching data protection laws if you don't know where the data is stored on the AI platforms that you use. The supply chain risk that I spoke about a moment ago exists. The businesses, if they're going to be adopting it, will need to make sure that they can survive an outage, because we've seen the sort of catastrophic sort of events of people suffering cyber attacks, being back to pen and paper and being unable to function. And again, I think AI will only continue to spread across all that we do, which means that we need to still have a capability to do things manually in the event that your digital systems go offline. Human oversight, I think, will remain all important. AI is clever, but it doesn't have the depth of experience that experienced practitioners have. So a lot of people say use it as an able intern, but you wouldn't sort of, without checking that, post it off to your best client or take it at face value. It would have to have some quality assessment put in place to make sure the output was appropriate. And I think that will continue to be very important for organizations. There's already within the legal sector been instances of AI apparently generating fictitious cases which have been submitted inadvertently to a court, which has created a whole raft of problems. So the quality assessment of the output will be big, and testing and resilience. That it falls to security teams to make sure that the full digital infrastructure of an organization is safe, and AI will be no different. Not taking it at face value, not seeing it as a silver bullet. One thing that happened to me with AI recently is it confessed to me that it had lied. Which I found utterly astonishing. I'd asked it to do something and it couldn't do it, and delayed. And then I said, if you can't do this, tell me. And it refused, and then it admitted it lied, said it was a barefaced lie, and when I asked why it had lied, it said because it values getting the job done more than honesty. And I think that is astonishing, but it's only once you sort of understand what the priorities of these algorithms are that you can start to spot weaknesses. So we've all heard about AI systems hallucinating, etc. So the quality assessment and security assessments are all important. So yeah, it's a classic case of all that glitters isn't gold. And if you're going to, sort of put it into your business, you need to understand the risks and make sure that the appropriate governance is there to support it.
Yeah, I think it's terrifying when I hear examples of that where, AI is sort of hallucinating when they say, look, it's explainability of AI seems to be such a topical thing at the moment because, why are we trusting all these things? Yeah, 99.9% of the outputs might be right, but there's going to be that all we need is that 0.1% chance that they've got something wrong, but they say it with such conviction.
Yeah.
And we don't then challenge it. The implications, the ramifications can be astonishing, can't they?
Yeah, absolutely. But this is why it takes experience to be able to spot when the output is incorrect. So, whilst everyone talks about AI compromising jobs and slimming down workforces, that will obviously be the case. But I also think it will create different jobs. So I wouldn't be surprised if, either behind the scenes or within organizations, you will start to then get armies of people that start to quality assess the information that is coming out of it. So whilst it will undoubtedly impact the labour market, I do think it will create opportunities too. Things like prompt engineers, is something that, must be a relatively new skill. So with new technology, it brings new employment opportunities.
Well, even I was thinking when you were speaking earlier about the Cyber Resiliency Act that, I'm sure there's a lot of consultancies whose eyes have kind of lit up at the opportunity of having cyber resiliency specialists and stuff, because as you mentioned there, it's so multifaceted and you need to be able to speak to so many different teams, different personas, and relying on a company internally, trying to get the CTO to speak to the CIO, the CFO, who all have different agendas and different ways of speaking. That's going to be very hard to empower people to do. Maybe a consultancy, there's some opportunity getting these people that really understand how do I speak to all of the different stakeholders and all of these teams' different priorities.
Yeah, absolutely. And even when one thinks about, conventionally, if somebody had a skills gap within their organization, they would go to market, they would find a professional that could help, they would deploy their services, they would solve the problem. Whereas now there are very few whole solutions. It takes a multifaceted approach to be able to deal with this, because it is multifaceted. It deals with law, it deals with risk, it deals with crisis management. In the market, there aren't a huge number of providers that have these skill sets that are able to go into businesses and speak about not only what the law says, but also what it means in practice and how to make the most meaningful and impactful changes within your business to be able to stand up to cyber risk.
Absolutely. So I guess kind of following that thread and looking ahead from a regulation and legal standpoint, what do you think are the biggest sort of challenges given the rapid advancements in sort of AI and technology?
So undoubtedly achieving levels of practical resilience, because for the first time ever, really, we're stepping away from what people somewhat crudely call tick box compliance. So it's no longer just enough to have a plan. You have to have a plan and you have to prove that it works. So I think going forward will be much more scrutiny about the overall levels of resilience and, the testing of it and the proof that it works. And that is a challenge, because, it's not just a case of, well, we need to do A, so once we do A, we're fine. That's just the starting point. It has to be done. It has to be rehearsed. You have to learn from it and it has to evolve. So quite often people say that, cybersecurity isn't a destination, it's a journey. That same mantra would apply to resilience, because there will always be new threats. There will always be new ways in which your business can be compromised, and you will always have to take account of those in the exercising and validation of the existing measures that you've got within your business to make sure they work. So I think it's the practical implication of effective levels of resilience that's the biggest challenge that face businesses today.
That's such an interesting way of describing it, that it's a journey, not a destination, because I think there's that sort of battle as well in a lot of businesses, particularly kind of years gone by, of compliance doesn't equal security. And in the same way, compliance does not equal resiliency. And, creating that paradigm shift or that kind of mental shift in businesses that, yes, you've achieved this tick box compliance, but that does not mean you are cyber resilient. And with the focus being cyber resiliency, we need to be much better.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is no one size fits all. It has to be bespoke, because the individuals within the business are different. The job functions that sit within a business are different. The way in which they interact with third parties and cyber threat is brought to their business is different. So you have to take account of all of those things to say, well, this is what's happening internally, this is what's happening externally, and this is how your team would need to respond and manage, and what the expectations would be in the event they suffer a crisis.
It's a unique perspective and a unique angle looking at it specifically from the legal and regulatory standpoint. So thank you for all your kind of contributions today.
Thank you very much.